The first lie was the silence. It was a thick, cloying thing, a woolen blanket soaked in river water and draped over the city's heart. It muffled the truth. Here, in the autumn of 1888, the silence was what you noticed before the stench, before the damp that seeped into your bones, before the taste of coal smoke that coated the back of your throat. From her small, cramped room at 13 Miller's Court, Mary Jane Kelly knew the silence was a language all its own. It spoke of things respectable people paid good money not to hear. Tonight, it was broken by the sound of a man's heavy boots stumbling through the narrow, cobbled alley. A cough, wet and ragged, followed. Mary flinched, pulling the thin, threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders. She stood before the single, cracked looking-glass, a relic from a life she barely remembered. At 25, the ghost of a great beauty still haunted her features. High cheekbones, wide eyes the color of the Irish Sea, and a spill of auburn hair that, when clean, gleamed like copper in the light. But tonight, in the weak flicker of a single tallow candle, her reflection was a stranger's. The eyes were too old, shadowed with a weariness that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. There were faint blue veins at her temples, a fragile map of her anxieties. She had been beautiful once. It was a phrase that clung to her, like a shroud. She'd arrived in London from County Limerick with a head full of foolish, sun-drenched dreams. Domestic service, she'd thought, a clean uniform, a kind mistress, perhaps a shy courtship with a handsome tradesman who smelled of sawdust and promise. Children with his eyes and her hair, a small scrubbed doorstep on a quiet street. The dreams had dissolved like sugar in the rain, leaving only a bitter residue. Now, her reality was this single room, a grimy 10 by 12-foot box, the last stop before the abyss of the workhouse or the cold stone of the street. A sharp cry from the court outside sliced through the silence. A woman's voice, raw with desperation, cut short by the flat, meaty sound of a slap. A door slammed. The silence rushed back in, heavier than before, broken only by the incessant, rhythmic drip of water from a rusted pipe somewhere above. It was the metronome of Whitechapel, counting down the seconds of their lives. Mary squeezed her eyes shut. She wasn't in a grand Mayfair drawing room. She was in the city's diseased gut, the hidden underbelly that made all that starched respectability possible. This was a rookery, a maze of crumbling tenements and foul-smelling gin shops, a place where survival was a ravenous god that demanded a daily sacrifice.
Her own survival depended on the whims of men who sought her out in these shadows. She smoothed down the worn velvet of her best dress, a deep crimson that was starting to fray at the seams. It was her armor. Outside, the fog swirled, a thick, yellow miasma that clung to the gas lamps, turning their glow into a weak, jaundiced smear. Through her grimy window, she saw a shadow detach itself from a wall and move on. Every footstep, every cough was a potential client, a potential threat. The acrid tang of coal smoke mingled with something else in the air, the smell of unwashed bodies, stale beer, and a misery so concentrated it felt like a physical presence. Mary Kelly had been beautiful once. Now, she was simply trying to live until morning. The next day, the sun was a pale, indifferent disk in a sky the color of dishwater. Mary sat nursing a cup of weak stewed tea in the common kitchen of Crossingham's lodging house on Dorset Street. The air was thick with the smell of boiling cabbage and the low murmur of 30 or 40 souls sharing the same precarious existence. Here, for 4 pence a night, you could buy a bed and the thin illusion of community. When she couldn't make the DOS money, she slept rough, a terror that never lessened with familiarity. Across the long, scarred wooden table, Annie Chapman coughed, a dry, rattling sound that shook her thin frame. Dark Annie, they called her, though her hair was a mousy brown. The darkness was in her eyes, in the perpetual circles of exhaustion beneath them. She'd been married once, to a coachman, and lived a decent life in Windsor. Now, in her late 40s, she sold wilting flowers and cheap matches, supplementing the meager income with the same trade as Mary, when the hunger became too much to bear. "Have to be careful, Mary," a soft voice said beside her. It was Elizabeth Stride, a Swedish woman with a gentle face and an air of sorrowful dignity that she never seemed to lose, no matter how dire her circumstances. Long Liz, they called her. The streets are getting harder. Mary nodded, taking a sip of the bitter tea. They're all getting harder, Liz. What choice did they have? Domestic service paid a pittance, barely £12 a year. A girl like Hannah Culwick, a maid-of-all-work, wrote in her secret diary of scrubbing floors until her hands bled, terrified of losing her place because the girl before her, Margaret, had fallen ill and ended up on the streets. For a woman with a child and no husband, the 1834 Poor Law offered a stark choice: the workhouse, where they would be ripped from their children, or this. Ellen, a woman Sarah Wise, a social investigator, had spoken to, put it plainly: "I'd rather die than see my babies in the workhouse. I know what happens there. Families split apart forever. The rent man don't care if you've got hungry babies. He wants his money." Ellen worked from a basement in 7 Dials, charging 6p a time. The mathematics of survival left no room for the luxury of morality. A young, well-dressed man entered the lodging house, his face etched with a mixture of professional concern and personal revulsion at the squalor around him. Dr. Alistair Finch. He ran a small, poorly funded surgery around the corner, patching up the casualties of Whitechapel's endless war against itself. His eyes scanned the room, and for a moment they met Mary's. There was pity in them, and she hated it. Pity was useless. It couldn't pay the rent. Dr. Finch had a patient to see, a girl named Agnes, no more than 17. He'd found her huddled on her bunk, shivering despite the stuffy air. He'd seen her 4 times in 6 months. His case notes, written late at night by lamplight, were a litany of despair. Patient Agnes, M., admitted March 14, 1882. Severe lacerations, consistent with violent assault. Patient states she works at an establishment on Commercial Street, refuses to name perpetrator for fear of losing her employment. Malnutrition evident, weighs approximately 6 stone. Symptoms consistent with consumption in early stages. He gently examined the fresh bruises on her arms. "Agnes," he said softly, "you cannot go on like this." She wouldn't meet his gaze. "What else is there for me, doctor?" she whispered. He had no answer. He could treat the injuries, dose the consumption with laudanum, but he couldn't treat the poverty. He couldn't mend a society that ground its most vulnerable underfoot. He wrote to a colleague, his frustration bleeding onto the page. "The women who come to me are not the wicked creatures portrayed in moral tracts. They are human beings crushed by circumstances. I treat their injuries and diseases, but I cannot treat the desperation that brings them to my surgery in the first place." One evening, a proposition came, not on the street, but through a woman who knew a woman. A place in a house over in Pimlico, a mid-tier establishment, a world away from the 6p fumbles and dark alleys. It was run by Mrs. Henderson, a formidable woman with hair like spun silver and eyes as sharp as glass shards. "You have quality, child," Mrs. Henderson had said, her gaze sweeping over Mary, assessing her like livestock. Ashamed to let it go to waste on the cobbles. Here you'll have a clean bed, good food, and protection. All you have to do is be agreeable. The house was a revelation. It had plush carpets that muffled your footsteps, wallpaper with printed roses, and the scent of beeswax and lavender. For the first few days, it felt like a rescue. The other girls, like Rose, a newcomer, barely 16, whose family had died of fever, were treated with a kind of firm charity. They were given hot baths, decent dresses, and 3 meals a day. Rose looked at Mrs. Henderson with the adoring eyes of a saved soul. Mary knew better. She remembered the feeling, the treacherous wave of gratitude that made you forget you were a prisoner. She saw it in Rose's face and her heart ached. The hidden truth was in the ledger Mrs. Henderson kept in her locked office. Every dress, every meal, every doctor's visit was recorded as a debt with inflated interest that grew faster than any of them could ever hope to repay. They were not employees, they were indentured property.
Josephine Butler, the fiery reformer, understood this perfectly. She wrote of these women not as a separate, fallen class, but as sisters, daughters, mothers, who found themselves with no choice but the choice between starvation and survival on terms dictated by male desire. Butler had the courage to go where other respectable women wouldn't, visiting brothels in Liverpool and Birmingham, documenting the hypocrisy of a system that thrived in the shadows. She wrote in her diary about a high-class house in Edinburgh. Downstairs, respectable gentlemen conduct business over brandy and cigars. Upstairs, young women, some barely more than children, service the sexual appetites of the same men who vote on laws governing public morality by day. Mary saw this hypocrisy firsthand. One of the regular clients at Mrs. Henderson's was a magistrate, a man whose pronouncements on public virtue were regularly printed in the papers. He was a portly man with moist hands and a sanctimonious air. In the parlor, he would speak of charity and the importance of uplifting the poor. Upstairs, in the privacy of a room with a bolted door, he was a different creature entirely. He treated Mary with a cold, detached efficiency, as if she were a piece of furniture. Afterwards, leaving his money on the mantelpiece, he would lecture her on the importance of prayer and repentance. The double standard was so profound, so complete, it was almost its own form of madness. Alice Mitchell, a woman who had worked in a similar house, had kept a diary, a secret record of the mental gymnastics required to endure. "We tell ourselves stories to make it bearable," she wrote, "that we're actresses playing roles, that we're saving money to start legitimate businesses. I used to dream of opening a little shop selling ribbons and lace to ladies. Now I know better, but the dreams helped for a while." Mary started to have her own dreams again, foolish whispers of escape. But where would she go? What would she do? Mrs. Henderson had brought in 2 more girls, sisters who looked no older than 14. They had been begging on the streets. They ate the hot soup Mrs. Henderson offered with a desperate, heartbreaking gratitude. "It makes me sick to watch," Alice had written in her diary, remembering how it felt to be rescued. Want to warn them, but what good would it do? Where else would they go? The question hung in the perfumed air of the house, unspoken but understood by all. There was nowhere else to go. The news arrived like a winter storm, chilling the city to its core. On the 8th of September, the body of Annie Chapman was found in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street. Dark Annie, Mary's friend from the lodging house kitchen.
It wasn't the death that was the shock. Death was a constant neighbor in Whitechapel. It was the manner of it. The papers, which had barely registered Martha Tabram's murder, now screamed in bold black headlines. The killer had not just taken her life, he had desecrated her body with a terrifying surgical precision. He had taken things. A new name entered their vocabulary, whispered in the gin palaces and lodging houses, scrawled on the walls by frightened men and angry vigilantes: Jack the Ripper. The fear was no longer a dull, ambient hum. It was a sharp, piercing shriek. It was personal. This wasn't some distant, random act of violence. This was Annie. Quiet, coughing Annie who had once been a coachman's respectable wife. The killer hadn't just murdered a prostitute. He had murdered someone they knew. He had reached into their world and ripped it open. Mary fled Mrs. Henderson's house that night. The illusion of safety had been shattered. The plush carpets and lavender scent now felt like a gilded cage, a fattening pen. She ran back to the squalor of Miller's Court, back to the foul familiarity of Dorset Street. It was no safer, but at least the danger was honest. Here, no one pretended they were anything other than what they were, hunted. Dr. Alistair Finch saw the change immediately. The usual bravado of the street women was gone, replaced by a raw, animal terror. They moved in pairs, their eyes constantly scanning the shadows. He found himself treating more women for nerves, for sleeplessness, for the deep, hacking coughs that worsened with the damp and the fear. He felt a profound sense of shame. His society, with all its wealth and progress and Christian morality, had created a hunting ground. As the writer George Bernard Shaw would later declare in the Star newspaper, this was not the work of a single monster, but the inevitable result of a social system that creates monsters by denying basic dignity to its most vulnerable. The last night of September was a vortex of death. The city awoke to the news of not one, but two murders committed within an hour of each other. The Ripper had struck again, a double event. The first victim was Elizabeth Stride, Long Liz, gentle, sad-eyed Liz who had tried so hard to hold on to her dignity. She was found in Dutfield's yard, her throat cut. The killer had likely been interrupted as her body was not mutilated, but he was not finished. Less than an hour later, and only a few streets away in Mitre Square, he found Catherine Eddowes. Kate had been in police custody for being drunk and disorderly just hours earlier. Upon her release from Bishopsgate Police Station at 1 a.m, the desk sergeant had told her she could go. "All right," she'd replied cheerfully. "Good night, old cock." She had 4 pence in her pocket, enough for a bed, but she needed money for food. She headed back towards the warren of streets where a woman could earn a few coins, walking directly into the path of the phantom who stalked them. Her death was a brutal echo of Annie Chapman's. The violence was unspeakable. Whitechapel descended into madness. The press fed the frenzy with lurid speculation and gruesome detail. Vigilance committees, armed with pokers and planks of wood, patrolled the streets. The police, led by men like Inspector Frederick Aberline, were hopeless, inundated with false leads and crackpot theories. To them, the women had previously been a nuisance to be managed. Now they were victims in a sensational drama, yet still viewed through a lens of contempt. The newspapers referred to them as women of dissolute character, maintaining the boundary between worthy and unworthy victims.
For Mary Kelly, the world had shrunk to the four walls of her room at number 13 Miller's Court. She tried to stay inside, to keep the door bolted. She had a fella, Joe Barnett, a fish porter who cared for her, but their relationship was strained. He hated her working the streets, but his wages were rarely enough. They fought constantly, the tension of the murders poisoning the air between them until it was unbreathable. She was ill. A deep, wet cough had settled in her chest, the kind Dr. Finch called consumption. She was losing weight. Her beauty, the only currency she had ever truly possessed, was flickering out. The landlord, John McCarthy, was a decent man as landlords went, but he had his own family to feed. The rent was 7 shillings a week, an astronomical sum. She was falling behind. "I don't ask questions, Mary," he told her, his voice not unkind. "But business is business. If I refused to rent to the ladies, half my properties would stand empty,
but you must pay your way. The days bled into weeks. The autumn chill deepened. The fog seemed to be a permanent shroud over the city. Mary felt trapped in a nightmare from which she couldn't wake. Every creak of the floorboards, every shout from the street sent a jolt of terror through her. She saw the faces of Annie and Liz and Kate in her dreams. She saw the Ripper's shadow in every corner. On the evening of November 8th, Joe Barnett left for good. The final argument had been vicious. He threw a few coins on the table and stormed out, leaving her utterly alone. The silence that descended was absolute, a crushing weight. She sat in the dark for hours, the coins cold in her hand, not nearly enough for the rent she owed. Desperation was a physical thing, a cold claw in her gut. She had to go out, one more time. She knew it was madness. The police constable on the beat, a man named George Godley, knew her by sight. He'd once written in his private notes, "Elizabeth Stride pays me no trouble, always polite, but I've watched her health decline. She's developing the hollow look they all get eventually." Mary knew she had that look now. She splashed cold water on her face, pinned up her hair, and put on the crimson velvet dress. It felt like a costume for her own execution. Stepping out into Miller's Court was like stepping into a cold, dark river. The fog was so thick she could barely see the end of the alley. The familiar smells of Whitechapel seemed sharper, more menacing. She walked towards Thrall Street, a wraith in red velvet. The streets were eerily quiet. Even the most desperate men were wary. She saw a figure under a gas lamp. He was well dressed for this part of town. A dark coat, a glint of a watch chain. He had a thick mustache and a quiet voice. He seemed gentle. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to hide, to bolt the door of her room and never come out. But the image of McCarthy's face, the thought of the cold street, the gnawing emptiness in her stomach, it was a more immediate terror. "A cold night, sir," she said, her voice a fragile wisp of sound. He smiled, a brief, thin curve of his lips. "It is indeed. Perhaps you know of a warm room nearby." The coins he offered were gold, more than enough for the rent, more than enough for food for a week. It was salvation. It was a death sentence. She knew it, in the deepest part of her soul, but the mathematics of survival had made their final, terrible calculation. "I do, sir," she whispered, turning back toward the suffocating darkness of Miller's Court. "It's not far." She led him through the twisting alley, her hand trembling as she unlocked the door to number 13. He followed her inside. The last thing the city heard from Mary Jane Kelly was a faint, wavering snatch of a song, an old Irish ballad called "A Violet I Plucked from My Mother's Grave." Then the door closed, and the silence of Whitechapel reclaimed its own. The morning of November 9th, 1888 broke gray and pitiless. John McCarthy, the landlord, was a man of routine. Rent was due, and Mary Kelly was behind. He sent his assistant, a young man named Thomas Bower, to collect. Bower knocked on the door of number 13. There was no answer. He knocked again, louder this time. The silence within was profound. He walked around to the side of the room, to the window where a single pane of glass was broken, stuffed with a man's old coat. He pulled the rag aside and peered into the gloom. What he saw would stay with him for the rest of his life. A searing image burned into his memory. He staggered back, his face the color of ash, a choked animal sound escaping his throat. He ran, stumbling and screaming for McCarthy. "For God's sake, get the police! There's been another one!" Dr. Alistair Finch was summoned to the scene. He had seen death in all its squalid forms: disease, accident, drunken brawls, but he was not prepared for this. The police stood back, their faces grim and pale, letting him enter the small, blood-soaked room. The air was thick with the coppery smell of it. He saw her on the bed, or what was left of her. The Ripper's fury, held in check with Liz Stride, had been unleashed here in its most complete and cataclysmic form. It was not a murder, it was an annihilation. Dr. Finch felt a wave of nausea, a cold, professional detachment, the only thing keeping him upright. He saw the crimson velvet dress folded neatly on a chair. He saw the ashes in the grate, where the killer had burned some of her clothes to give him light to complete his gruesome work. He recognized the curve of a cheekbone, a lock of auburn hair untouched by the carnage. It was Mary, the girl with the sad, sea-colored eyes who hated his pity. His clinical mind cataloged the horrors, but his heart broke. He thought of his case notes, the endless litany of suffering he had recorded. Patient weighs approximately 6 stone, symptoms consistent with consumption, malnutrition evident. The Ripper had not killed a healthy woman. He had merely finished the job that poverty, disease, and societal indifference had already begun.
Storytelling. The murder of Mary Kelly was the apex of the terror, and its end. The killer was never seen again. He dissolved back into the fog from which he came, leaving behind a legend and 5 dead women whose names became inextricably linked with his. Months later, Dr. Finch stood at the window of his surgery, looking out at the endless rain slanting down on the greasy cobbles of Dorset Street. The headlines had moved on. The public's brief, horrified fascination had waned. The Ripper scare was over. But for Alistair Finch, it was not over. He saw it everywhere. He saw it in the new girls, fresh off the boats from Ireland, their faces full of the same doomed hope Mary Kelly once had. He saw it in the work of reformers like William Booth of the Salvation Army, who wrote that these women were not depraved, but trapped, casualties of a system that offered no escape. He saw it in the international trafficking networks that moved girls like cattle from Brussels to London, their vulnerability a source of immense profit. The true, horrific secret of the Victorian brothel was not the sex, or the disease, or even the violence. It was its function. It was a pressure valve, a necessary component of the great, grinding engine of empire, designed to service the needs of men while rendering the women who did so invisible, disposable. The horror was not that the system was broken. It was that it was working exactly as intended. He looked out at the street, at the flickering gaslight on the wet pavement. He thought of Mary Kelly singing her sad Irish song as she walked to her death. The song had ended. The door had closed. But the silence that followed was a lie. The sound of her story and the stories of the thousands like her had never truly stopped. It echoed down the century, changing its tune but never its theme. The gaslit alleys had become neon-lit massage parlors, the street corners had become internet forums, but the ancient, brutal mathematics of desperation remained the same. The ghosts of Whitechapel were not gone. They were simply waiting, in the shadows of a new age, for the world to finally listen.